Well, good morning. I believe it's 9:30, so time for us to begin this morning. If you're like me, it's good to see the sun shining. It'll be a little warmer today than it was earlier in the week. I think we experienced several different seasons this week from Monday to today. Before we begin, we'll start with prayer. Any prayer requests? A friend of Miss Gloria's from Louisiana had open heart surgery this week, so he's recovering. Mr. Curtis has got shoulder surgery coming up again May 7th, so need to remember him. Okay. So Betty Dickerson. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Remember Jaden Thomas. He's struggling with RSV right now. Susan. Okay. All right, if you will, bow with me and we'll begin in prayer. Dear Lord, I just want to thank you for this day you bless us with as we begin our class this morning. There are several that are on our hearts and minds, many who are recovering from surgeries, Miss Gloria's friend, and Miss Betty, who's still recovering and having some other health issues. We pray that you be with her, and also those that have surgeries coming up, Mr. Curtis and Miss Lena. We pray that you be with them and the doctors, and the Lord be with Dante Stutz as he continues to struggle. We'll just go with this through this class this morning. Forgive us for all our many sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. I'm hearing a little bit of ring there, Nate. I don't know what to tell you to do about it, but maybe you can play around with it. So has anybody figured out what we're going to be studying about this morning? Moses, yep. I guess you get credit for the answer, right? I wasn't specific. Do we all have weaknesses or sins that we struggle with for whatever reason? Temptations and sins that maybe we struggle with harder than other people. We all have kind of our, challenges. What would, if you had to guess or based on your studies of Moses, if you had to pick maybe what his weakness or maybe what sin he struggled with more than others, what do you think that would be? Anger. He seemed to, for whatever reason, well, I don't know. From a human perspective, I can sympathize. We can sympathize with a lot of what brought him to anger, and it's I guess kind of what we're going to look at this morning. Because did God get angry with the Israelites? Yes. So it's a little anger is one of those sins and struggles that I would say. Some of us probably struggle. I would say all of us have probably struggled with anger at times in our lives, right? And maybe still do. Maybe some of us can control it, better than others. But it does. We're going to look at it. It does seem like if you had to pick something, or at least that we're told about that Moses struggled with more than anything, it seems to be anger. Is anger in and of itself a sin? Yeah, Ephesians, I think 4:26, be angry and sin not. So again, anger is one of those, you know, it can be complicated, I guess. So to get us kind of lay some groundwork, the first list there, and you can Google this, but there's, for the sake of our class, 5 levels of intensity in the emotion of anger. Because anger, is it an emotion? It starts out that way, at least, right? And you can Google that. You know, different people will use maybe slightly different words than what we're going to use. Some may say there's 4 stages of anger, so it's not an exact thing, but this will help us, I think, when we discuss Moses in particular, and then ourselves here just a little bit. So number 1 is irritation. Irritation is a feeling of uneasiness that is brought about by an unpleasant disturbance. Has anybody ever been irritated? No. All right, the next one, we're going to come back, we'll kind of go through these and then we'll come back and discuss some stuff about them. The next one's indignation. Indignation is a reaction to something that is perceived to be unreasonable or unfair. Doesn't necessarily have to be unreasonable or unfair, but at least we perceive it that way. The next one is wrath. So when you get to this level, and you're going to see these are kind of progressive things. From 1 to 5 is kind of, you know, not in all cases. Sometimes we can skip or go through these pretty quick, but in a lot of cases we'll start out, something will irritate us a little bit or maybe a lot. Then sometimes, depending on what it is, you know, we can feel indignation because of something we've seen happen that may not even be related to us. It might be, you know, we see something happening to somebody else that we feel, you know, well, that's unfair or not reasonable, and it'll give us that. And if you've ever felt that, it's hard to describe that feeling, but if you ever felt that, you probably know what I'm talking about, that feeling. But the next, number 3, is wrath. And when you get to this level, at least for the sake of our class, it must be expressed in some way. With wrath comes a strong desire to defend oneself, or in the case where, you know, you're witnessing something happening to somebody else, you have this strong desire to step in and take action. Number 4 and 5, they get a little, can be blended together. You might could condense this to 4 levels, but number 4 is fury. This usually manifests itself in acts of violence that are sometimes accompanied by temporary losses of sanity. Has anybody ever been there? Or we've witnessed people get there maybe. And the last one, which is similar, is rage. And this is the most hostile and dangerous stage of anger. And I think this is the stage where more times than not, you're going to violate Ephesians 4:26. This is where you go from the first few stages of irritation and indignation that are feelings and emotions, and when it gets to the point of rage, we're talking about a physical action. This can overcome people to such a degree that they'll explode with acts of brutality, devoid of any conscious awareness of their violent outbursts. So that's your difference between fury and rage. When you get to the point of rage, it's almost like you become a different person. And there have been, you know, instances of this where people, especially non-Christians who aren't governed by Ephesians 4:6 or not trying to follow God, to where they don't fall under any, in their minds, rules, where when they get to this point, this is where, what's a common, we think of the word rage, what's the first thing that comes to mind in our day and time? Road rage. And you think about that when you hear of stories about that, where somebody gets an instance where somebody cuts them off, and the next thing you know, you see the story on the news, well, they pulled their gun out and started shooting, and it ends up being just a normal, well, we'd say a normal person. We think, well, man, they, you know, see people talking about them on the news. It's like, well, man, we never would have thought they would have done that, but because they were just, it's like a switch flipped and they're out of their body almost and behaving uncharacteristic to their normal behavior. And that's what we're talking about when we get to rage. A lot of murders, or most, are curated from folks in fits of rage, and you'll see where the people, they don't even know, they can't even remember exactly what they did because they, were so enfueled by anger that they just, lost almost consciousness of their actions.
A lot of times their excuse though is, well, I don't remember what I now.
Right, yeah, and to some degree, a lot of times they don't remember, but like you said, when it comes down to it, it is an excuse, right? And we're going to see that, I think, even with Moses, that while you might not know what you did, was it still wrong? Yes. Yeah. So why is it important for us to study about anger? So we can try not to follow in that trap. I mean, because is that something we are all at risk? We talked about last week perils of the godly. So this could be a peril if we're not careful, because I think we all can admit that there's times in our lives where we're irritated, where maybe we feel indignation, and you just keep going down the list. So as you get further down that list, the more risk you're at of actually committing sin. So we need to study about it so that we can learn to control that and maybe avoid it. Okay, so as Ms. Beverly correctly stated, we're studying Moses, so let's talk about Moses a little bit. Numbers 20 is where our class is this morning, but we're going to say Numbers 20 is present day. So before we look at present day Moses, let's look at a little bit of his history, some things that we've already kind of covered. Right, Exodus chapter 2 and Acts chapter 7, what did Moses do? He killed a man. In studying that story, does it tell us Moses was angry? Yeah, and do you think when he saw that Hebrew being abused by the Egyptian, do you think he felt some indignation for that? What was happening to that Hebrew? Was it unfair and unreasonable? So it started out as probably, indignation in that case would not be a wrong thing to see someone being abused and want to help them. But it appears that Moses probably went, we don't know, maybe very quickly to number 5, right? And, we don't understand possibly that day and time. I mean, Moses at this point was 40 years old, had been brought up. A lot of folks theorize he was already a leader of the Egyptian army and a proven, person of battle. We know that later on we're going to see, there were battles and wars. So their viewpoint on taking someone's life might be a little bit different than our normal, viewpoint. And probably even in our day and time, there are, military people that, have different experiences that we have that may see it a little bit different, but to a lot of degree, kind of as Mr. Melvin said earlier, to get to the point where you're able to physically take another person's life, a lot of times that's going to take that emotion of rage, and that appears to be, from best I can tell, probably where Moses was at in that case. Because what did he do immediately after that? He hid the body. And he, it says before that, he looked around to make sure no one was looking, but then he hid the body. So that is a little bit of to me, you have to question, did he realize he had done wrong in that case? The Bible doesn't come right out and say Moses sinned and did this, but because we do know he was looking out for God's people, he thought that purpose in life was to lead the people, but we know he got a little ahead of himself and ahead of God, as we talked about before. But it does appear in that case where some anger was definitely involved there if you look at the clues. And when we talk about sin, what a lot of times come with sin, you know, physically and on this earth. Consequences. And you can look at this and see what was the consequence of what Moses did in this case. He had to flee. So just some clues there. So let's look at one that we don't, you know, we don't look at as closely sometimes. Exodus chapter 11. And we skipped over this section because it's Moses dealing with Pharaoh. I'm going to read, of course, what did God tell Moses was going to happen with Pharaoh when he went to Pharaoh and said, let my people go? He was going to harden his heart. Pharaoh wasn't going to give in right off the bat. He was going to be difficult, right? Did God not, quote, warn Moses about that? Exodus 11, I believe it's, did I write that down right? Let's see. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, get out, you and all the people who follow you, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. What do you think about when you think about hot anger?
He was at very extra rage.
Yeah, he was getting close to rage. What does it make you think about? Has anybody ever been in hot anger? Have you ever been so mad that your face starts burning? That's kind of what I picture there. Moses' face was probably red. So, and why was Moses angry at this point? Because Pharaoh said no. But hadn't God told?
But Moses forgets God.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we can forget sometimes. And sometimes can situations not cause us to forget what we already know? And even him going into that situation, knowing the way Pharaoh behaved, it brought about that reaction. And I guess the one good thing we can see is, what did Moses do? Yeah, he went out, and at least he got up and walked out, right?
But God told Moses again, the next few verses, I'm doing this for a reason.
Right, yeah. God, had to explain it to him again. But again, all of that dealing with Pharaoh, and it finally got to the point where that last time, just Moses was so angry. I can't say that Moses was sin right here because he was just angry. Maybe this is where he was angry and sin not. But again, we're saying anger was a weakness for Moses, so he was, again, letting himself get to that point of being in danger there. Exodus 32, I think we talked about this story, but what happens in Exodus 32, verses 15 through 19? Yep. And why did he do that? Yep. And I guess I should have turned while y'all were turning. Similar to the deal with Pharaoh,
His anger burned.
yep. Go back to, first, Exodus 32, I believe verse 8. And this is, Moses has been up on the mountain for a long time, getting the 10 Commandments and stuff. And of course, we know what Aaron and the people had done. They'd made this golden calf. Well, in verse 7, and the Lord said to Moses, go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed it and said, these are our gods. Think God was mad? Was God angry? What's some clues there that God was angry? How'd he refer to the people? Yeah, they're your people, Moses. So, I mean, you kind of feel sorry for Moses, because you got God himself saying, hey, go down to them, your people. You know, that probably didn't sit too well with Moses. And what does he say in verse 10? What was God about to do? Yeah, but what does Moses do? Verse 11. Yep. And you have one of our stages, oh Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt? And I guess before we go any further, is there a difference when we talk about anger, God's anger and our anger?
Well, look at Jesus. Jesus drove him out of the temple
Yeah.
because he was angry.
Right.
He says he did not sin.
Right. You know, when we talk, you know, we want to be like, you know, we're to strive to be like God, but I guess I would say that's one case where we're incapable of handling, in most cases, anger and wrath. And, you know, God being the ultimate judge, when he carries out his wrath, he's carrying out judgment, whereas we're not qualified to carry out judgment. Yeah.
For us, we often perceive infraction and are not well founded. When God perceives an infraction,
It's right.
sometimes it's
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, with a lot of things, for us, with that emotion, it's perceived, whereas with God, it's always accurate. And so, and in verse 14, the Lord relented from what he was going to do and did not destroy the people. And as Melvin pointed out in verse 19, so Moses goes down, and as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, just like with Pharaoh. But what did he do this time? Yeah. He threw the tablets down, and if you go back to chapter 31, verse 18, who wrote on those tablets? Yeah, so he's holding these tablets and that God himself had written, and he throws them down out of anger. So what do we see kind of about anger there with Moses that, you know, can kind of help us? Did Moses know what he was fixing to go see?
Yeah, God told him.
God told him. So what happened there? He wasn't prepared. Can actually experiencing and seeing things affect us more than just knowing things? Yes. Yeah.
Well, if somebody told you something was gonna happen, you might not believe it. But if God told you it's gonna happen, you know it's gonna happen.
Yep.
looking at Moses, talking about his weakness and everything, he has this ruts towards anger, he falls into them quickly, and like the verse we have later where it talks about being slow to anger. He's not slow to anger, speeds off into it.
Right. Appears to. Yeah.
When weakness seems to work is we have these ruts and we fall into them quickly, and we're not prepared to think ahead before it happens. We're not all in.
Right. Yep. And I think we had to apply that, because when I asked earlier, do we all have weaknesses? Some of us may not struggle with anger, but we may struggle with other sins, and that can be similar to the way Moses appears to be with anger. If we're not on guard, we can be overtaken by those temptations quicker than maybe our, others can, or maybe quicker than we can with other temptations.
I blame Aaron a lot because he should have known better.
Oh, Aaron definitely should have known better.
Moses
Yeah,
did. He wouldn't have let the people.
yeah,
But look at Aaron. Aaron let the people talk him into doing things.
yeah,
A lot of times we got people talk us into doing stuff, and that's a big sin too.
yeah, yeah,
All sin's a big sin.
right,
That's something that gets to us.
yeah. Well, and
Much of a leader.
Aaron wasn't, and that you go all the way back to the burning bush, and you have to think about Moses' resistance to taking on the challenge, and so God allowed Aaron to come along, and he wasn't the choice, and now you see why he wasn't the choice, and it causes Moses' problems as well as the people. Even though Aaron did some good things at times, he definitely seemed to be of weaker character as far as being able to be swayed by the people. So let's look at, and we'll come back, more comments on that. You can, and again, like some of the other situations, it doesn't necessarily say Moses sinned when he threw these tablets down, but you can look at some clues later on. I know Deuteronomy 10, verse 3, what eventually has to happen because Moses broke these tablets. Moses had to write them this time. He has to end up going back up to the mountain. And you can see in Deuteronomy 10:3 where maybe it's a little bit of a hint, suggestion, because God says, go back up the mountain because of the tablets that you broke, kind of reminding Moses, hey, you did this. So again, another consequence to letting anger get the better of him. So let's go to Numbers 20. Verses 1 through 13, and we start out with, and the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there, and was buried there. So this is getting pretty close. I mean, Moses has been leading the people for pretty close to 40 years by this point, so they've been at it for a while. In verse 2, now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? Now, had any of these people most of these people even been in Egypt? Most likely not, and if they were, most of them were probably really, really young, because remember, they've been wandering because of their parents had, refused to go in and trust in God when they had their chance. In verse 6, then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Moses doing okay so far? Yeah, he did what God told him, right? All right, verse 10. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them.
What before Moses was told to strike a rock.
Right. It's a real similar situation to before, isn't it?
But God didn't punish the people this time. He let them have the water.
Right.
He punishes Moses and Aaron.
Yeah, so what are some things we can gather from this? One, it's as Mr. Melvin's already said, it's a real similar instance to something that happened nearly 40 years ago, right? People were grumbling and complaining about water, and what did God tell Moses to do at that point? Told him to strike the rock. Moses struck the rock. So is it necessary the action? Yeah, true obedience is in the details. Is it important to do what God says? Exactly like he says, even if it may not make sense, or we may think, well, you know, and I don't think this is the case with Moses. I'm going to say I think he was at number 5 on the list. I don't know that he was really thinking, but even at times we may think, well, you know, I was okay striking it before, you know, what's the big deal? He said, talk to it, I'm going to strike it. I don't think that that's what went through Moses' mind. I think for whatever reason, when he got before the people, he got so mad that because how many times did he strike it? What's that kind of sound like? Sounds like lashing out in anger, doesn't it? Right. Yeah. Yeah. And like we said, he started out good, right? They came to him complaining. He and Aaron went to God. God told him what to do. But, you know, we're not told exactly what all happened. But, I mean, you got to think when he gathered that assembly back together, you know, you think they still complaining, grumbling? So something set him off, right? Going back to what Bronson said, he was, you know, maybe had a short trigger at this point. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. And I think, go back to what we talked about last week, Aaron and Miriam, when they stood up against Moses, would that be enough for most of us to feel irritated, feel indignation, maybe have some wrath and rage toward our siblings if they treated, of all people, if they treated us this way? But did Moses? In that case, he didn't, right? He's described as meek and humble. Yep. It seems like it had been recent, right, from the way we read. Yeah, which is something for us to watch out for, right? We have to be aware sometimes the situations we put ourselves in, which I'm not saying Moses put himself in this situation, but we have to be self-aware and conscious of, well, this person catching me off guard, you know, I didn't sleep good last night. Somebody comes up to me with something that maybe yesterday wouldn't have bothered me a bit because of some other things that I got going on. None of it that person's fault. They just catch me at the wrong time and set me off. That, you know, happens to us sometimes. So we have to be aware of that. And that could have been, you know, again, Moses has been leading the people how many years? Almost 40 years. So maybe it's wearing on him a little bit, and he's not as strong. And again, this temptation that he seemed to struggle with more, even though he had been controlling it pretty good, and we have to be aware of that too. You know, those things we struggle with, even though we can get them beat down and control them pretty good, in moments of weakness, it can come back and bubble to the surface.
Meekness is the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
Looking at his failures with his anger and getting hot and fast is power.
Yeah.
Meekness is power under control.
Right.
Opposite side of the coin.
Yeah. 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 It is. Yeah, he is getting a little old. We get cranky when we get, I'm told we get cranky when we get old, don't we? Somebody else gonna say something?
Moses being the leader of the nation, God couldn't let them get away with sin before all of that.
Right, yeah, and you're getting into the next, what was so sinful about this?
He didn't obey God.
He didn't obey God, and as Ms. Dean said, what did his actions take the focus off of?
Focus on what God, of God.
Yep, took the focus off of God, and these people were complaining. They needed to see the power. They needed to be reminded again of the power of God. And in this case, again, we may not always understand, but whereas before Moses striking the rock was the appropriate thing to show his power, in this case, what needed to happen was Moses to speak to the rock to show these people that that's all it took for God to bring water out. But instead, Moses, out of anger and rage and frustration, struck the rock, which was not what God wanted to happen. Now, as somebody already said, did God still allow the miracle to happen? Yes, he still met the need because the people needed water, but there were, as we've already said, consequences.
Can you imagine leading 2 million, about 2 million people?
Yeah, you feel for Moses, don't you? And I guess maybe it's a sobering and scary thing when we look at ourselves.
Also, identify the lack of faith, because it says, because you did not believe what God's talking to you.
Yeah, show the lack of, and one of the, I think the bottom of your sheet, or maybe the second page of your sheet, one of the lessons we learn is that when you get down to it, acts of obedience, it stems from unbelief. And just as God told Moses, and as Bronson pointed out, Moses failed to believe God, I guess, and that's kind of a mouthful there. One, he failed to trust and believe that God's plan, he took matters into his own hands.
Moses striking out the rock took his anger, took some of his anger away, but he could strike at something,
Yeah, right,
and it worked before,
yeah,
he thought it would work again.
yeah. And I think something that we can't visually see, but I suspect in the first case when Moses struck the rock, did he strike it in anger? No. You think that's, in this case, it seems to be more of so he lost his cool, right? He let his anger cloud his judgment, lost his cool. So that's a different impression that it's going to give upon the people. In this case, who did that put the focus on? Put the focus back on Moses, and even Moses' words, must we bring, water from this rock. So again, it just messed everything up from what God was intending and what God wanted. But again, God is above people, so he's still going to carry out his plan, whether we as his servants do it correctly or not. We're not going to be able to defeat God. So a couple of things. When you go back, we talked about this last week or week before, Numbers 11, something just kind of going back to part of what Ms. Dean said, some of the sobering things that come to my mind when I look at Moses. What was going on there in Numbers chapter 11? Doesn't have anything to do with anger, but what did Moses have a whole lot of to help him out? So much so that there was enough, God could take some of it and give it to 70 other people. Spirit of God. Did that keep Moses from sinning? Did it protect him from consequences of sin? So, that we don't have the Spirit in the same sense that Moses had it, but we do have the Holy Spirit to help us and to guide us. But what do we have to do just like Moses? We have to obey, and we have to allow that Spirit to guide us. Where don't really know exactly how the Spirit worked with Moses, but in this case, Moses was able to choose not to tap into it, right?
But it just shows us how faith works.
Yeah.
All of us, we elevated at sometimes, and, in the middle, and we just rock bottom.
Yeah, we have our ups and downs in life, for sure, and Moses was not any different. So we already kind of said that acts of disobedience stem from unbelief, and so another second lesson we can learn from Moses in this case is and Miss Dean already hit on this, a public act of disobedience diminishes God's glory. Does that make sense? We don't rate sin, but when we publicly go against God as Moses did, it takes away all the glory from God, and we have to be aware of that when we're out in public. If we're not behaving the way we should as Christians, we can do more than just damage to our own salvation. We can, damage, outreach and effectiveness of evangelism and ministry and all of those things if we behave publicly in disobedience to God. And another big one that we see here with Moses, an act of disobedience, even though it's forgivable, can bear painful consequences. What was Moses' painful consequence? Didn't get to go to Canaan land. Does that feel pretty harsh to anybody? Yeah, all that he put up with for 40 years. And with the golden calf, what was God about to do? About to destroy them. Moses wouldn't have been dealing with these folks in Numbers 20, would he? You can think of all kind of reasons. You go back to shortly after they had come out of Egypt, what were they about to do? Well, they were about to stone Moses. It was a couple of times they were about to stone Moses, but you think about the spies when they went in. That wasn't a very long journey. It wasn't very far into this task. So, to some degree, Moses signed up for a short tour of duty, right? He went in, dealt with Pharaoh, had the people. They were headed to the promised land, sent the spies in. They were ready to go, and the people chickened out, basically, right? And what was God going to do even in that case? He was going to destroy them and start over then, right? In both of those cases, who stepped in? Moses. So again, you feel for him because Moses has been fighting for these folks even when God was ready to destroy them. And do you think it bothered Moses that he wasn't able to go in the promised land? Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting when you go back to what he claimed was a weakness. Maybe it was at one point, but at this point he's overcome that, right? He's gotten past all that. Deuteronomy 3:23. This is fast forwarding a good bit, because if you go on in Numbers after the story we looked at, the Israelites start defeating all these armies and nations, and so even though Moses sinned and there was this consequence, one thing we can learn from him is he continued to lead the people and do what God commanded him to do. But in Deuteronomy 3:23, this is getting toward the end where Moses is kind of reminding the people and advising them to continue to follow God. In verse 23 of Deuteronomy 3, and I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord, you have only begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand, For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Please let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that good hill country in Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me because of you and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, enough from you. Do not speak to me of this matter again. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift your eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward and look at it with your eyes, for you shall not go over this Jordan.
This guy did let him see it.
Yeah, he did let him see it. And, you know, that's kind of tough. But what does
God's anger still against Moses because of his sin.
yeah, and because he kept asking, you know, I think we can, if any of us that are parents, you know, have probably been through times when our kids keep begging us for stuff and eventually makes us angry, right? What does Hebrews 12:6 say though? We're about out of time, but it's something that we need to keep in mind when it comes to consequences here on this earth.
Yeah. Those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines.
Right,
And just like we love our children, we distill discipline.
right.
It's not fun for either one.
Yeah. I mean, again, God, ultimate wisdom and providence and knowledge, you know, he's going to discipline, though, as the scripture says, those that he loves. And, you know, we don't know what God knows. You can theorize a whole lot of things, but we already said, how old was Moses by this point? He's over 100 at this point. He wasn't ready to give up and quit. I mean, he wasn't ready to retire. I think part of his personality, being the type person he was, and going back to what Bronson said, you know, he was committed to this task at this point. It probably, I'd suspect, part of what bothered him so much, other than he did have faith and believe in God, he knew where the people were going, and he wanted to go there too. But I think he also wanted to finish the job. But maybe God understood him better than he understood himself and knew that, well, you know, he was letting this anger was getting to him too much, and God knew he needed to discipline him. And if, who knows, if Moses had continued on with the things that were still, because were the Israelite people really going to get any better? You know, so it might have been part of God's providence that he knew to protect Moses' ultimate salvation. Moses needed to face this consequence and not be allowed to go in, because looking for Matthew 17 verse 3, what's happening there? That's the transfiguration of Jesus, and who's present? You think those earthly consequences to his sin felt as bad at that point in time? So I think that's, you know, there's a lot of things we can learn from Moses, but that's one thing we can learn is, you know, don't let those earthly consequences, when God disciplines us, you know, don't let that affect our ultimate salvation. We have to, you know, remember the ultimate goal. And I think we see that with Moses, that even though he really wanted to go in, you know, he still did what God told him after that and repented of his sins and, you know, continued on. It didn't stop him from asking God to allow him to go in, but it also didn't keep him from ultimately being in heaven.
You know, Paul asked God 3 times to remove his thorn in the flesh.
Right, yeah,
That's not wrong for asking,
right,
but we need to accept the
yeah.
answer and move
You're right. Yeah, we need to know when to stop asking. And I guess one benefit Moses had is he spoke to God, you know, face to face, so he probably realized it, you know, that point in Deuteronomy chapter 3, okay, I've asked enough. I need to move on at this point, which apparently he did. So a lot we can learn from Moses about anger and how to guard against it and how to try not to keep the right things in mind so that we know when we need, you know, sometimes we may need to remove ourselves from situations when we can. You know, Moses couldn't always remove himself from those situations, but we do have to remember ultimately what we're about and what the focus needs to be on. And I hear kids coming in, so I kept you a little late today, but thank you for your comments.